Well, we only meet once in a while, so I'll give it a few more minutes to see if anybody's gonna show up a little bit late today. You know what, while we're waiting for people to come, I guess we can play this spot the tort game that I have. And these are just examples of torts in the wild that are really just ridiculous scenarios. Accidents waiting to happen. I'm sure as you guys were, those of you who live like on or near campus and moved from somewhere, you know that experience of loading down your vehicles with everything you can manage. And this is just a really bad idea, right? Like carrying a washer and dryer on the hood and the trunk of this little car, like.
They got it ratcheted down really well, though.
I mean, points for those tie downs, but still, like, this is, that potential tort in the wild. And then this Parks and Rec crew, somebody had a really terrible idea. They wanted to make sure they could dry the field really quick to have a kids ball game. Those tournaments are important money makers for some of these Park and Rec facilities. So somebody thought they would just set the field on fire to help it dry off quicker. Ended up costing $50,000 to clean up, which probably is more than whatever they would have lost by having to cancel some games because of the wet field. So, we can see some examples of that kind of stuff. Torts in the wild. Looks like we have a few more folks that joined us. I'll run through the roll really quick. And then for today's class, what I decided to do was do like an exam review. Y'all did better on the second exam, definitely than like the first exam. But I still think that we can even do better on this exam, right? So instead of some of the fun, what I think is kind of fun, some of the theoretical stuff that we did in the last class, this one I wanted to have more of a traditional like review session for you guys and just make sure we do cover a lot of the topics. I know I gave you some like study guide topics to kind of look at, but I just wanted to sort of hit the highlights in these chapters. And so it'll be like a sped up version where I skip over a bunch of slides and just sort of go through some of the slides from all these chapters that are going to be your next test. This exam is going to be easier and harder than the other ones for different reasons. It's going to cover a little less material. So we've only got 4 chapters instead of 5. Like you found out, so that's better. And what makes it a little trickier is there's really only 2 big topics that are being covered, right? So chapter 6 and 7 are kind of paired up because those are all really like connected to tort law. Chapter 7 is product liability, but it's connected to tort law. And then chapter 12 and 13 are both versions of contracts. So let me jump into the roll really quick before I go off on a tangent and start talking about actual content. When you hear your name, just let me. Okay, so I will jump into chapter 6 and 7 really quick first, and then hopefully I'll spend the bulk of the time on 12 and 13, because as you know, the chapters aren't all equal in length either. And so what I did is I went through the list of topics that I had, and I sort of circled some slides I want to make sure that I cover. So we get the basics of, okay, so you can get the basics of what we're covering in each chapter. One study technique that I've shared with maybe a few of you that come to office hours that I recommend doing is taking these PowerPoints that I've posted online when you're reading through the chapter and printing them like 3 to a page with the notes lines, because I think that's a helpful way as you're reading through to like write down important stuff in the chapter. And then it helps you not have to write down every single little thing, but it gives you something to do while you're reading to help it like reinforce the material. Because the PowerPoints cover the highlights, they don't have all the details or whatever, but there's things you're going to know better, be more familiar with, things that might bring information to you, and it's going to be different for every one of you as you go through the chapter. So that's a little study technique that I think is helpful for some students to give you something to do while you're reading instead of just reading and like kind of reading it and not really thinking about helping it sink in. So the basic foundation of tort law, which covers chapter 6 and 7. I flipped the order. I'm going through these in numerical order, but I flipped the order because I wanted 6 and 7 to sort of be a reward for, I know this sounds silly, but a reward for you as you completed chapter 12 and 13. The contract chapters are really important in the world of business, right? Like contracts are everywhere in your life, but they're a little dry and kind of boring sometimes because it's just all these little nitpicky things with contracts. Whereas torts, like we saw with the goofy pictures that I showed you at the beginning of class while we're waiting to get started, can be a little bit more entertaining. I mean, some of the things are really tragic and horrible, but some of the things are just ridiculous. And so as you're learning about torts and like product liability, that covers the world of like people just doing stupid stuff, dangerous toys, like all those kind of things. And the world of contracts can be a little bit more, detail specific and a little more dry and not as interesting. But going into torts, just in general, torts are civil wrongs that are not coming out of a contract, but it's that breach of some kind of legal duty that a reasonable person would have that causes some kind of harm or injury to somebody else. The idea behind torts for compensation is somebody did something wrong, hurt somebody else, and they need to be compensated, like they got hurt, or somebody's got to, pay for these injuries or replace the property loss or the money or something like that. So those are kind of the two basic concepts of court actions. When you're dealing with actions, a plaintiff is going to sue somebody, that person is the defendant that's getting sued, and they're seeking some kind of damages to recover the cost of their harm, like their medical bills or the cost of their injury. And when we look at damages, you want to know the types of damages that are available to be recovered. Compensatory damages, it's the value of the injuries or damages sustained by that person that was hurt. They can sometimes be broken down into special damages and general damages. So special damages is that quantifiable amount that you can measure. So this person, because of someone else's actions, they got hurt, they broke their arm, they went to the doctor, got put in a cast, they recovered. What is the cost of that? Maybe physical therapy, the cost of the ER visit, the cast, all those kind of things. Maybe they missed a day of work, the lost wages for that day. And we can kind of calculate what that total recovery cost was, right? And then general damages, sometimes things can't really be measured out like that. You don't have a doctor bill and, pay stub to like calculate it from, but there is something that was lost. Like they had pain and suffering from this injury that would have happened other than that person's bad behavior. And so those kind of things are those general damages. They're sort of estimated things. And then there's punitive damages, and those can be kind of punitive, like punishment damages to kind of deter this kind of conduct in the future. Like if somebody's, involved in this lawsuit and that was just really terrible behavior, and you've, heard that expression, like make an example showing them just how bad their behavior was. It's only appropriate when it's just really, really bad situation, very just egregious, outrageous, shameful, just awful, reprehensible kinds of stuff. It's not when someone just messed up. It's something where they just did something really terrible, horrible. And this is kind of just a side note. I don't think I have anything else on the test, but legislative caps on damages. When you hear about tort reform, raise your hand if you've ever heard that term before. It's like a political term you might have heard like candidates talk about. It's not talked about as much now as it has been in the past, especially after the McDonald's coffee case. Have you heard about the McDonald's coffee case? You guys remember that? Okay. So the idea came about with like some of these outrageous jury verdicts and stuff. And so sometimes you have situations with states where there's this tort reform where a state might create a law, like legislative statute that says this is a cap on certain kinds of damages. And there's arguments on both sides of that, just like with everything else, about why that might be good or bad, but it's a thing for sure. And then when we come to the classification of torts, we have two basic types of torts: intentional and unintentional torts. So intentional torts, you did something intentionally. Maybe you didn't intend to hurt that person. Like if a kid's playing baseball in the backyard, somebody throws them the ball, they hit the ball. They intended to hit the ball. They did not intend to break Miss Susie's window across the street, right? That feels like it'd be unintentional, right? But it's still intentional because they intentionally hit the ball and then that intent is transferred over to the action happen. Unintentional is the negligent kind of stuff. They should have been more careful. They were speeding and they hit a mailbox. You see what the difference is? Like the intent was about driving. They were speeding. That was a little negligent, maybe reckless, depending on how fast they were going. And they hit the mailbox. They're responsible for that. And when I was putting together your study topics list, One of the things I suggested is to know the elements of the torts. I won't go through every single one of these intentional torts, but there's a slide on each one of these as you're putting together your study guide. When I'm giving you an exam question and testing you on a particular tort, it's important to recognize the elements of that tort, because I'm just going to tell you not a story, a brief hypothetical story, but I'm just going to say, like, you know, Leah did this thing and this happened to her, and, you know, was there a tort involved? Is Sam responsible for this? Is Leah responsible? You know, that kind of situation. So knowing these elements, you'll recognize them. So for example, an assault, it's something that happens, you know, word, action, that makes another person fearful of imminent physical harm. So it's a reasonably believable threat. If it's not obviously threatening, then it's not a reasonable person standard. Someone would reasonably feel like they were in danger. But if somebody's coming up to you with a closed fist, what is your reaction going to be? They're coming after you like this. You think they're about to hit you, right? Or punch you or something like that. Any reasonable person in that situation would think that. But just someone giving you like side eye or dirty look, like that may not rise to the level of what a reasonable person would expect in physical harm. See what I'm saying? Like the difference. An assault can occur even if there's no actual contact with the plaintiff. So again, someone's coming at you with a fist. Reasonable person would be like, I'm going to duck out of the way because it looks like they're about to hit me. You know, an assault occurred. A battery, you often hear them together because a battery is that impermissible touch. So someone makes contact with you. So that fist is coming at you. You've been assaulted because you're scared they're going to hit you. And they actually hit you. Then what has happened? Yes, a battery. They've actually contacted you. That wasn't within your permission. You were trying to duck out of the way, but they hit you anyway. So it's that unprivileged intentional touching another. It can be something that's harmful, like you get hit, you get punched, that would hurt, that could cause an injury, or it can be something merely offensive. So if someone kisses you and you don't want to be kissed, that's not necessarily going to leave a physical bruise, but that's still unwelcome touch that you don't want. That's also the definition of a battery. So a lot of times we see assaults and batteries going together because, you know, you have that apprehension of something is about to happen and then it actually happens. But if there's that apprehension something's gonna happen and then they miss, like they go to punch you and they're so drunk, fall over and they miss. Okay. Did a battery happen? They intended to commit a battery, but they did not. But an assault still happened because you were still worried they were gonna hit you. That kind of thing. So you see how I'm saying like learning these elements can help you recognize them on a test. False imprisonment. Somebody give me an example of a brief hypothetical scenario that would be false imprisonment. Someone like has you over to have a talk, like, and they won't let you leave. You know, they're like, no, you're not going to leave until we've resolved this argument. And you're like, I want to leave. I don't want to be here anymore. You know, they're confining you to staying at their place or having this conversation. The confinement can be the use of physical barriers, like they're blocking the door and they're saying, no, you're going to stay here and we're going to work this out. Maybe you don't want to work it out. Maybe you're done with this relationship or whatever and you want to leave. Use of physical restraint. That's a more severe circumstance. Someone like ties you to the chair and won't let you leave. Or threats of physical force. Like more than just blocking the door, they're threatening to like physically restrain you if you try to leave, that kind of thing. Interferes with the freedom to move without restraint. And so when we talk about these different things, we also talk about, I have on your study list, the defenses. So as you're thinking about these kind of things that are intentional towards, what do those elements look like? So how do you recognize it in a test question? Also, is there a valid defense? So if we see a situation where it looks like someone is being held against their will, is there an acceptable reason for that false imprisonment? Can you think of a scenario where it'd be okay to keep someone confined? Yes. It's okay. Okay. Anybody? Okay, what about a shoplifter? Someone just got caught shoplifting or attempting to shoplift, and you're the person that works in the loss prevention office. You know, you can't keep them there forever, but it might be justified to keep them there as the police are on their way, right? Those kind of things. Let's see. And then potential infliction of emotional stress is another one. Defamation, and IIED is one that is always, people always sue for it. They rarely win because we're talking about situations where it's like not just something that's annoying, it's something that's really severe, egregious conduct, right? It's kind of like punitive damages. That doesn't just happen all the time. People might ask for it all the time, but it's only gonna be situations where it's really extreme bad conduct. Same with the IIED, only really extreme situations. Defamation, you're hurting somebody's character, hurting their reputation. There's two kinds of defamation. Right up here, what are they? Libel and slander. Does that sound familiar? Which one's written and which one's verbal? Okay. And slander is when someone talks about it. Okay. Those are important things to kind of just commit to memory so that, again, if you see an example of somebody was talking about someone else or someone was texting you about someone else or putting an email or something, you'll know the difference. One thing I do want to talk about is this concept of per se. It comes up first in your book as slander per se, but it can happen in other situations. You can have negligence per se. When something is, a tort per se, what that means is that you don't need to prove special damages because it's something that any reasonable person would also see as a problem. So slander per se are false statements that nearly anybody, reasonable person standard would consider this harmful to their reputation. Someone having a loathsome disease, somebody was spreading a rumor about someone else having like an STD, like universally, most reasonable people would be offended by that and would feel like that's damaging their reputation. Those kind of things. Negligence per se, for example, if someone is breaking rules for safety that exist, we're going to say they were negligent because they are clearly breaking that rule. This rule exists for safety reasons. They were violating that. And so we don't have to prove that they breached the duty of care because we can prove they weren't following the safety standard. So when it's per se, it's actionable without having to prove those kinds of things were harmful to you. And then of course we have, just like the else, they all have defenses. So you want to look at all these different torts that you learned about in the chapter and say, when is this an actual tort and what would the defense be against this? Truth is typically what people are going to say is the defense when it comes to defamation. I didn't spread a lie that hurt their character. That's actually the truth. So if people know about it and it could be proven, then the tort hasn't been committed. Jumping over, let's see. Fraudulent misrepresentation. It's a fancy way to call someone a liar. We're talking about untruths. It's a misstatement or omission of a material fact knowingly made. So someone's a liar. There's a difference between fact versus an opinion. We've all met someone who's one of those, slick salesmen that has lots of great things to say, and a lot of those are going to be opinion claims. And that's not the same thing as someone flat out just being a liar about stuff. Okay, torts against property. So we talk about torts against people with all those kind of torts we just covered. These are about property. We have real property, which is like your land, your house, that kind of stuff. And then we have personal property, also called trespass to chattels, trespass to personal property. Trespass to land, you guys have heard of this before, you're familiar with that. You don't get to go on someone's property without an invitation or a reason to be there. That's walking on their land, driving on their land, shooting a gun over someone's land, controlling a drone over someone's backyard, throwing rocks, all those kind of things. That's all trespass to land. And then we also have trespass to personal property, also known as trespass to chattels. That's the old-fashioned way of saying it. Makes more sense to you if you're not a lawyer to call it trespass to personal property. And that is interfering with someone else's personal property. So if someone gets in your car without permission, you can't just drive away with someone sitting in your car. You're like, get out of my car, or if they even caused potential damage to your car, like maybe they used a Slim Jim and like broke into your car or something like that. They could potentially be liable for destruction of property and interfering with your use of that property. which is similar but different to conversion. Think of conversion as a more severe interference with your personal property because someone has taken or they're using or they're retaining possession of your property and belongs to someone else. So let's say you have a friend or a roommate and you let them borrow your iPad or something, and you expect them to give it back like the next day. And they're like, oh, I really enjoyed borrowing your iPad. And they just keep it. And they keep it. And you remind them to give it back. And they keep it. And they keep it. They didn't really steal it from you, like take it without permission, but their use of it has gone way beyond what you originally let them do. You know, that's an example of conversion failing to return goods. I also wanted to talk really quick about the disparagement of property, just like we talked about defamation, where, you know, someone is harming someone else's personal reputation and character. There can be disparagement of property. So slander of quality versus slander of title. These are things that are kind of easy to confuse. If someone has a business, let's create a fake business where they are selling stuff. Slander of quality says don't buy from them because their stuff is junk, right? How is that different from slander of title? If I say don't buy from them because what? Their stuff is stolen, maybe. You see the difference? Like you're still slandering the business, but you're slandering it in different kind of directions. So slander of quality is saying, you know, false information about the quality of their product versus slander of title is false information about, you know, whether that stuff is legally owned or something like that. And then the other big category of torts we have the intent. Those are intentional torts, the unintentional torts, negligence. The important thing to remember when it comes to negligence, when it comes to torts, is remembering these 4 elements. So just like when you're learning the definition of the different torts, understanding in order to have a claim for negligence, you've got to have all 4 of these things. Duty, a breach of that duty. That breach was the causation of whatever happened, whatever harm. And then damages because there's some legally recognizable injury. You know, that's something that shows the harm. Something being annoying is annoying, but it may not be, you know, you can't sue somebody over them being annoying, but they harmed you in some way. There's a recognizable, legally recognizable injury, then there's damages in that situation. When we're talking about those 4 elements, you know, I just rattled them off really quick, but you know, if you read through the textbook and as you went through the material in chapter 6, there's like a section on each one. So there's a little bit more nuance to each one, but just to cover them quickly, you know, that duty of care is important, that people are exercising whatever that reasonable duty of care is. If you're a normal, regular person, that's the reasonable person standard that we see popping up all over the place in law, right? But if you're a professional, that duty of care is what a reasonable professional would do. So if your friend describes some symptoms to you and says, hey, what's wrong with me? Like you might have a little experience or you might have gone to Google to figure out what's going on, but you only know what you know, as opposed to if your friend had those symptoms and took them to their doctor and the doctor missed that diagnosis. You see how there's a different level of care standard, that duty of care based on someone who has knowledge and experience of a professional versus you asked your friend, your neighbor, your roommate, those kind of things. And so that's important to think about when you talk about negligence, is that what is the duty of care and, you know, that reasonable person standard versus the duty of professionals. Causation, I already talked about that. Foreseeability. So with causation, you know, it's pretty clear when we're talking about just the basic, you know, this was the duty, they breached the duty, that caused the harm. The problem that gets a little bit more complicated when it comes to causation is foreseeability. And as you noticed on the list of study topics that I gave you, this is the first one I ever gave you that had an actual case listed on it, right? Because normally I tell you, like, you don't need to know the details of the case, and you don't need to know a lot about this case, but I did want to go over the case to make sure everybody was familiar with it a little bit. And it's the Palsgraf case, Palsgraf versus Long Island Railroad. If you remember from the book, anybody want to tell us about the case? Let me just tell you a summary of it. The situation was this guy trying to catch a train. He was running late to catch his train. You remember that? And he's running and he's got a box in his arms, like that's his carry-on personal item or whatever. He's running to catch this train with this box that's not labeled, it's in his arms. And the people at the train station are trying to help him catch the train because it is literally like pulling away. So he's trying to get on. Doors are closing, he's pulling away, and he's like running to jump from the platform to get on the train. And as the guards, whoever they were helping him get on the train, he kind of slips. He makes it on the train. His box doesn't make it on the train. Okay, he sort of just drops that package he's carrying. What was in that package, folks? Anybody remember? It went boom. Do you remember that part? Package exploded. It was fireworks, close to a bomb. I'm sure the lady that got injured probably thought it was a bomb. So he's holding this package of explosive fireworks, and when it hits the tracks, it blows up. And because of that, that boom reverberates clear across the train station, across the platform, causes this scale that they used to weigh luggage to kind of like shake and fall, and it injures this little old lady, Mrs. Palsgraf, who is, you know, clear on the other side. And so she gets hurt because the scale thing like falls on her and hurts her. And so what's she gonna do? She's got medical bills, she's got injuries, she's gonna sue the railroad company. And she's like, your guys caused this. By helping this guy who was too late for his train catch his train, your, you know, causation, you caused this injury to me because you helped him catch the train. He dropped the box exploded. I got hurt clear on the other side of the train station. And she lost. She lost the case. And the reason she lost the case is based on this concept of foreseeability. So out of this case and out of this concept, we have the idea that people can have the cause of an accident happen to them. You know, we have proximate cause and causation, in fact, and we need to have the foreseeability that someone could be held liable. So the court said, the question before us is, does the duty of care extend only to those who may be injured as a result of a foreseeable risk, or does it extend also to a person who's outside the zone of danger, whose injury could not have reasonably been foreseen? The railroad was not negligent towards her because nothing in the situation gave notice of the peril to a person thus removed. Like, she was so far away from what happened, there's no way that we could hold this railroad liable for something that happened clear on the other side of the train station. You know, it was like, have you ever seen, you know, someone set up those complicated mouse traps or these long row of dominoes that go through all the different stages? You know, if something is not foreseeable, it's unfair to hold somebody liable to something that's so far down the chain of events. Yes, if this hadn't happened, then this wouldn't happen, then this wouldn't happen, then this wouldn't happen. But how fair is it to hold people accountable for those things that, you know, happen so far down the chain? And so that's where we get this idea of proximate cause. And proximate cause is that foreseeability of something happening. And then, of course, defenses to negligence. We have the main defenses to someone's claim that they were negligent is, you know, there's an assumption of risk. So if someone assumed the risk of doing something, you know, that's a defense to negligence. Superseding cause, something else happened, superseded this cause and caused the injury. And then contributory and comparative negligence. Contributory negligence is not as common. That says, well, you contributed to your own problem, so therefore this other person's contribution doesn't count. You know, they're completely off the hook for it, versus comparative negligence, where you sort of weigh the liability from when the negligence is shared with two parties. Okay, let me move on to chapter 7 really quick. Here in chapter 7. Chapter 7 is a shorter chapter than chapter 6, and it's following along with the same kind of topic that we covered in chapter 6. With tort law, but it's specifically about product liability, strict liability kind of situations. So the basic foundation of strict liability is if somebody's doing something that is, you know, abnormally risky, dangerous, then they're the ones that should absorb the risk of people getting hurt by that. Because you're willing to participate in this kind of stuff, then these are the hazards involved, that if somebody gets hurt, you're on the hook for it. So you're responsible for whatever harm happens to other people. It's more the norm than the exception, even though it kind of goes against to what we just talked about with like, did you have the duty of care? Were you as careful as you could be? It's just saying when these are abnormally dangerous activities, you're gonna be strictly liable. So if you have a pet tiger, wild animals are one of these areas of strict liability. Even if you're super careful about your pet tiger not hurting other people, you have a really great cage in your backyard or whatever, I don't know, for this exotic pet. If that tiger hurts somebody, you're on the hook because that's an abnormally dangerous activity, as opposed to if it was like a normal, typical pet, a cat or a dog, that you have no reason to know that that was an abnormally dangerous wild animal. Any kind of wild animal is going to fall into this category of strict liability. Other things that are abnormally dangerous, can you think of any examples? Things that explode, if you've got dynamite, you've got a shed full of fireworks or fireworks standing, that kind of stuff. If it catches fire and blows up, anybody who's hurt by that kind of activity, that someone was participating in, they have a really high risk of serious harm and danger to people. And so they still have to be very careful, but even if they're super careful, somebody still gets hurt, they're on the hook for that. And then the other kind of topic that we cover in chapter 7 is with product liability. Product liability is based on these same kind of theories that we just talked about in chapter 6. Negligence, misrepresentation, also we just covered strict liability, something's abnormally dangerous. And then there's breach of warranty. So for product liability, we're talking about being really careful with the products. If you're producing a product and putting it out with consumers, you want to make sure that it is, produced properly, you've got quality control, people are making sure that it's safe, that it doesn't have harmful chemicals involved. There's all kinds of interesting cases you can Google and look up with, abnormally dangerous toys, people putting materials in the paint or chemicals in the toy that are really not safe and no one caught that in quality control, or it was a design flaw or something like that. When it comes to these strict liability situations, there's basically 6 requirements for strict product liability. When it's been sold, was it in defective condition? So someone is suing this manufacturer because they bought something that was defective when they bought it. And the defendant was engaged in the business of selling, so it's not like, that's not part of their business. They're the ones that were selling it. This defective condition is what made it dangerous. And there was some kind of physical harm to self, to property because of this product. So, this product hurt them in some way or caused them harm. And that was the proximate cause. So again, back to that concept of foreseeability, like there's things that happen that are just sort of outside the realm of what anybody could have predicted. So we don't reach that far. And the goods must not have been substantially changed from the time the product was sold. Otherwise, that's a defense. When my kids were little, they had like one of those ride-on toys. Any of you guys had that when you were a little kid? Like the ones my boys had was like a Peg Perigo, like John Deere Gator thing. You've seen little Barbie Jeeps, like all those kind of like ride-on toys. Okay, when you get those from Target or Walmart, how fast do they go? Like 2 miles an hour. Got a fancy one, maybe it goes like 4 miles an hour. Okay, when my kids outgrew it, I just sort of put it at the curb for the trash, and a kid down the road picked it up, which I was fine with, I didn't care. And he put a motorcycle battery in that little John Deere Gator that my boys had. Okay, my boys were driving it. Like the most dangerous thing they did was like go up and down the hill in my yard. And like I remember one time my older son like put my younger son in the trunk and then pulled the thing that lifts the trunk and dumped him out on the grass and like drove away. And he was like mildly injured, more ticked off at his big brother than anything else, but he wasn't really hurt because it goes so slow. Well, the neighbor kid, he put in, like he really juiced it up with his motorcycle battery. All of a sudden that little John Deere Gator could fly up and down the road that I live on. I live on like a dead end cul-de-sac and he could just fly up and down that road. If my little kids had access to that kind of power at like 4 years old or however old, ever driving one of those, like little brother would have been real hurt when he got dumped out of the back of the John Deere Gator while he was driving down the yard, right? So you can see the distinction between something that has been substantially changed that made it more dangerous versus the way it was produced. And then proving that it was unreasonably dangerous when it's created, that threatened the consumer's health and safety, or that it was defective condition, like maybe normally this product is fine, but the one I got wasn't made right, and when I went to go use this blender, it exploded. And it injured me because of the broken parts of the machine, that kind of thing. Design defects, inadequate warnings. If you watch this video, this is a link to the McDonald's hot coffee case. It's an interesting video, but you know, inadequate warnings could be a reason the product's deemed defective. The reality behind the McDonald's coffee case is that the coffee was way too hot to have been served to the lady that's injured. And in fact, in the beginning, she was really only asking for medical bills to be paid. She wasn't even asking for like any other kind of compensation. The case sort of blew up because McDonald's is like, no, I'm not gonna pay for not even $1 of your medical bills. Like they just really were like lowballing her. So she had to take it to court just to try to get her medical bills paid. And it became like an internet sensation type case where everybody was talking about it. Okay, and then of course, other defenses to product liability. Besides just showing that there's no basis for the claim, you know, they can also say, you know, it's preempted. If someone's suing under state law, but there's a federal law that preempts it, you know, that can get a case tossed out. Assumption of risk. The injury that you suffered is a normal risk associated with this activity. So like you go snow skiing and you, or snowboarding and you get a snowboard or snow skis and you go down the mountain and you fall down and hurt your knee. You can't go and sue the people who made your snowboard or snow skis. That's like an assumption of the risk, or the ski resort, because that's a common thing. If you are new at skiing, to fall and possibly twist your knee or something, you know, that kind of thing. And you voluntarily assume the risk. Product misuse. Think about the little ride-on toy with the giant motorcycle battery for that one. Okay, so 11:30, we'll spend the next chunk of time in contract law. So another thing about the exam coming up is that because we're covering material that's so interconnected, like in chapter 12 and chapter 13 with contracts and with like all the tort and negligence kind of stuff in 6 and 7, I have for this exam set it up to where it's less questions, which hopefully is good. But the risk for that is the questions count more when you miss them. So this exam only has 33 questions. So each question, instead of counting 2 points apiece, will count 3 points apiece. But it's, you can think about it more and take a little bit more time on each question. And because some of the questions kind of combine concepts. So if it's a question about contracts, in chapter 12, we learned how to form a legal contract. You know, what's required to make something a legally enforceable promise? Because that's what a contract is, right? A promise is someone's assurance they're going to do something or not do something. And contract law is what is about that forming and keeping of promises. And if someone doesn't keep their promise, you know, that legal liability where you can take them to court to enforce that promise. And so some of these questions may overlap. They may not be just one chapter. It may have elements, you know, from both chapters because they're so closely related. So I was able to give you less questions with these hypothetical scenarios, but hopefully that helps you again, because the way that it's not one of the official learning objectives, but what I want for you to get out of this class is that ability to like use these skills in real life. You know, how is the stuff you're learning in this class going to really help you like today and in the future? And so being able to recognize that stuff in the wild, as I keep saying, like recognize it in the wild is really useful to you, like in your real life. So overview of contract law, again, legally enforceable promise. When we're looking at contracts, the important thing to remember is this concept of the objective theory of contracts. So the objective theory of contracts is again kind of the contracts version of that reasonable person standard. The intent to form the contract or what the contract is saying is going to be judged by those outward objective facts interpreted by a reasonable person. It's not necessarily the party's own secret subjective intentions. Nobody that I've ever met is a mind reader. You know, sometimes it might be helpful, but nobody has that skill that I've ever interacted with. And so we can't bring in assumptions or this is what I was thinking, or this is what I thought you were thinking into this. We have to look at it objectively, just based on what's really written, what are the facts and circumstances surrounding the situation when we're trying to understand the meaning behind a contract or what someone was saying. So these objective facts include, not what they were thinking, but what were they saying? What did they do? How did they act? How did they appear? And what are the actual circumstances that someone, objectively on the outside can look and see? And then just like some of these other things, when you're preparing for the test and you're looking at the elements stuff, in order to form a contract, we have 4 elements that you have to have in order to have a valid contract. We have to have an agreement, right? That's the basis for this promise, agreement. We both agree to these things, offer and an acceptance. We can have lots of offers and counter offers before we ever get to that agreement, but we need to have some kind of agreement. And then consideration is the second one. Any promises need to be supported by legally sufficient consideration. That's that bargain for exchange. That's what gives your promise value. How valuable is it to the other person? How valuable is it to you if you're engaging in this contract negotiation? It's important to remember that contract law is looking for legally sufficient consideration, but it doesn't protect against bad deals. Okay, so someone might be getting a good deal, this person's getting a bad deal, and it's still legally sufficient. Okay, legally sufficient means it has value to the parties. Okay, and then capacity is number 3. So in order to make this legally enforceable contract, we are looking for the parties to have contractual capacity. They're mentally competent, they're not a little kid, they're, legally old enough to enter into a contract with somebody else. They have that contractual capacity. And then the 4th element is legality. No judge out there is going to enforce a contract for something illegal. Someone can't say, they're a loan shark and this guy's got a gambling debt, he's not paying, and they go to the judge, hey judge, he's not paying this illegal gambling debt, like they'll get thrown out right away. So 4 elements: legality, contractual capacity, consideration, agreement. That's a really extreme example of an illegal contract. Sometimes it just comes down to it violates law in some way. Maybe the contract has a rate of interest that is above what is legally allowed or something like that, when it's calculated out. So there could be other reasons why it's not legal. Maybe it's not in the right form, or it is outside the statute of limitations. Those kind of things could also affect the legality. So jumping into types of contracts, bilateral versus unilateral contracts. Bilateral contract is a promise for a promise. So it's this exchange. I promise to do this, you promise to do that. We have a bilateral contract. Unilateral contract is an offer is accepted by the offeree's performance. So I might say, I will give $50 to the person who returns my lost bike or my lost pet or whatever, whatever the thing is. I'm offering this to the people that live on my street or in my house. I might tell my kids, I'll pay whoever wants to do it. I'll pay one of you $20 to go vacuum out my car, like that kind of thing. It's accepted when they are doing the activity. That's the unilateral contract. And then there's formal contracts versus informal contracts. So formal contract has some kind of special form that needs to follow. Like a check has to have a certain format to be considered like a negotiable instrument with your bank. Those kind of things. You can have certain formats that are required to be in writing. Contracts for the sale of real estate have to be in writing for statute of frauds. Same thing with, like a will or someone's last testament will. That needs to be in a certain format that cannot be changed because the person's not there to testify as to the truthfulness and validity of that. Another category of those kind of things that need to be in a certain format, like a prenuptial agreement. Those need to be in writing too. People can't just have like a handshake verbal agreement for something for a prenup, because you can see how those are the kinds of things that could go sideways and people could misremember what that agreement is. So there's certain types of things that have a tendency to have people remembering agreements in different ways, and that's why some of those require like things in writing. Executed versus executory. It's been fully performed versus it's been partially performed. And then we have, enforceable versus unenforceable. when it comes to contracts and part of your review topics, I said, I want you guys to learn the difference between valid, void, and voidable contracts. So, slide on this. Okay, here we go. So valid contract right here. It's a contract that has all the elements that are necessary to make a contract. It's got an offer and acceptance. So we have an agreement, consideration, capacity, and it's legal. That's a valid contract. A voidable contract is something that can be canceled at the option of one of the parties. And they can avoid the duty to perform. Or, so if they want to get out of it, they can get out of it because it's a voidable contract. Or they can ratify it when that thing is cured. An example of this might be a contract with a minor. Sometimes when people graduate high school, they're not quite 18 yet. But they need to move to wherever they're going to college and they need an apartment to live in. They might need a dorm or something like that. How would we handle a situation like that where someone is 17, they're out of the house, but they're not legally yet an adult entering into a contract? What do you do if you're the person who wants to rent out apartments or dorms to college kids? What do? You say, sorry, you don't get to have a place to live because you're only 17, come back when you're 18? You don't want to do that, you don't want to lose business.
Parents sound like waivers.
You could ask the parents to sign. That's one way to not make it voidable. That would be valid with parents. What if that's not an option? You might take the risk because you want to get this sold. Maybe you have a bigger deposit or something because you're absorbing a lot of risk when they have the option to avoid it. Whereas everybody else that you're making a contract with can't get out of it. That'd be a voidable contract. But what happens when September rolls around and that person turns 18 or whatever? In the future, it can be ratified. Okay, so once they turn 18, we've cured that problem of them being a minor in the contract and it's ratified and then it's a valid contract. But in August, if they decide they don't want to live there anymore, they can avoid it. And it doesn't mean they get to take advantage of it because we just have to unravel it to where everybody's just as good off as they were before they entered the contract. So, everything gets cleaned up. It's ready for someone else to move in. The amount of deposits returned or whatever, that kind of thing. And then void. So valid, voidable, and then void. What's void contract? It's another contract. Kind of a trick. Void contract it's void. It's not a contract. It might look like a contract, but it's not a contract because it's not enforceable. And remember, that's what the whole point of having a contract is for it to be enforceable. So it has no legal force or binding effect. The void contract is really no contract at all. Okay, going through these 4 elements, we have agreement. You gotta have that offer, gotta have acceptance. The offer needs to be definite. We can't have an agreement if people aren't agreeing on the same kind of things. People have to communicate their acceptance, just like we can't read their minds, know their intentions. We don't know if they've agreed to until they actually communicate that to us. They have to communicate the acceptance. It can be communicated in writing, an email, text message, by signing the contract, you're having a conversation, any of those kind of things. And if you have a specific way to accept something, like let's say part of your offer and agreement says, if you're going to take this, then sign here or send this form back in the mail, that acceptance becomes effective upon dispatch. So when they take that, whatever, they wrote it out or they signed a form or something like that, they put it in the mailbox, it's accepted. Otherwise, when is something accepted? Well, when you know about it, they send it a text message or email. It's pretty instant. They're standing face to face, they tell you, or that you watch them sign, that's pretty instant. But if you're waiting for the information to get to you, then it may not be quite as quick. Consideration, I kind of already talked about this. Legally sufficient value is, it has to be something of value in the eyes of the law. Doesn't matter if it's a good deal or a bad deal, it's just something of value. It could be, money value, that's easy value to measure. It could also be a promise to do something you don't have a legal duty to do. So I don't have to do this, but I'll agree to do this anyway. Or agree to not do this, even though I have every right to do this. So they're choosing not to or to do something. The important thing with consideration, and I have a note on here about on your topics that might have seemed like a weird topic, because I probably could have written it another way, but about covenants not to compete. And I should have written that topic differently, because really what that question is getting at for your exam is about something lacks consideration. If you work at a company and you've been working there for 6 months, a year, whatever, and all of a sudden your boss comes up to you and says, hey, they're having everybody at the company sign these contracts not to compete because maybe a competitor's moving in down the road in town, and they're worried about losing great employees to this competitor. So you're working there, you're doing your own thing, you're in your desk, and they hand you this piece of paper, signs covenant not to compete. What are you gonna do? I mean, you wanna keep your job, you don't wanna like ruffle any feathers. So most people are gonna be like, okay, and they just sign it and like go on. Okay, let's look at what we know about contracts and tell me if that's gonna be enforceable. We have 4 things we're looking for in a contract. We have offer and acceptance to make our agreement, right? What's the offer and the acceptance in that scenario? Well, it probably feels like they're offering you to keep your job if you accept the terms of not going to work for the guys across the street. You know, if you leave there within a period of time or a range of, you know, zip codes or something. We're gonna just take capacity and legality off the list. There's some details in employment law we haven't gotten to yet, so we're just gonna assume for the sake of this hypothetical that it's legal and that you're a grown adult and you have the mental capacity to enter into an agreement in an employment contract. Consideration is the question here. Is there legally sufficient consideration? If somebody just walks up to your desk, hands you a piece of paper and tells you to sign this commitment not to go work for competitors across the street. Yes, no? Hey. It's okay to guess. I mean, you'll learn as much from guessing wrong as guessing right, because we'll talk about it. They gave it to you, it's reasonable, you signed it. Is there consideration? Okay, you say no. Okay, why not? Or do you want to say yes and tell me why there is? You can go either way. It's a yes or no, like it's something. Anybody else have a guess? Come on, please, somebody just guess so we can tell, so we can all know the right answer. Be brave, it's okay. This is helping you prepare for the exam.
No,
Okay, you say no. Why?
because they give you time to consider.
Okay. What if they tell you you have a week to consider it and turn it back in?
And yes,
Okay. What do you guys think? Anybody else have any other ideas? That's a really good idea, but it's not true. It's not correct. Legally sufficient consideration has to have something of value. So when we talked about consideration, something of value, things that are lacking consideration would be a pre-existing duty, okay? So if you're already under this employment arrangement, even if you don't have like written contract, you kind of have an implied contract, that you work there and they pay you to work there and you work there and they pay you to work there, you know, that's something that already exists. They have to give you that paycheck because you did the work. They're adding an extra layer that's not supported by what you're already doing. So therefore, that new contract they just had you sign doesn't really have any consideration attached to it. Now, if they gave you that contract and said, hey, sign this contract, this non-compete agreement, and when you sign it, you'll get a $500 bonus. Would that have consideration? Does that meet all 4 elements? They have an agreement, they offered, you accepted, you signed it. Got mental capacity, we decided it's legal because it's reasonable terms, and they gave you a bonus. Even if they gave you a $50 bonus, a $500 bonus, that part wouldn't matter. It would be something additional for you giving something up that you otherwise have the right to do. Because otherwise, if you work there and the guy across the street offers you more money, you could just leave tomorrow and go work for them, right? So do you see that little distinction at all about the difference in something that's legally sufficient consideration? Okay, so. Okay, when it comes to settling claims of a contract, we have an accord and satisfaction. That is an agreement for payment other than performance, so other than what you originally agreed to perform under the contract between the 2 parties that have a right of action against each other. So the accord is someone who says, I know we agreed to this, and that's not going to be possible for me anymore. Will you accept this instead? Okay, and If they say yes, then we have replaced this element of the contract with an accord of satisfaction. Sometimes a contract claim will have a provision that includes an amount. If this goes wrong, this is the amount that can fix it. So liquidated debt, the amount that is due and certain in the amount. So if you say the contract is valued at this, you can estimate what that value might be. If it's unliquidated, like let's say you agreed to loan out this parking lot, and someone's gonna make money for this festival, and then something happens and they can't rent your parking lot. You know, how do you figure out how much the value of that is, or those kind of things, you know? It's an uncertain amount. So you might come up with a provision that says it's valued at this amount if this happens, that kind of thing. You can also settle contract claims with a release. So someone signs this contract and say, I agree not to pursue a legal claim in exchange for whatever. You know, let's say you have a small little fender bender in a parking lot. You really don't want that going on your insurance, especially if you're on your parents' insurance. You don't want your parents hearing about this and you say, look, I know this is my fault. I see a little scratch on your bumper. How about we make a deal? You don't file with my insurance. My parents don't find out about this. And instead I pay you $200 for the diminished value of this little scratch on your bumper. You don't even really have to get it fixed. This is okay. And they're like, sure, that's great. $200. I'm cool with that. You write up a little contract and that's kind of the release. In exchange for them receiving this money from you, they agree to release you from all these liabilities. It might also include a covenant not to sue. They agree not to sue you for damages. Okay, we talked about capacity and minors already. Intoxication, being drunk is usually not an excuse to get out of the contract, just FYI. It potentially could be voidable if they were so intoxicated to lack mental capacity. But if despite how drunk they were, they understood what they were getting into, not getting out of it. Again, objective theory, like they could say, I was so drunk, I had no idea what was going on. But then the evidence shows when you negotiated to a better price and you spelled your name right, and you wrote the correct date, and you insisted on your own copy, and you're saying you were too drunk to have a clue what's going on. No, that sounds like cold feet, right? It sounds like buyer's remorse. It doesn't sound like I was too drunk to know what's going on. And let's go into the last few minutes into the last chapter, chapter 13. Okay, so for chapter 13, more about contracts. Chapter 12, we talked about these basic foundations, how to create a contract that's enforceable. Think about chapter 13 as when contracts go wrong. You know, all this stuff in chapter 13 about how things get messed up, how people breach in lots of different ways, what are the remedies if they breach, how can you like rework it to where you can get something worked out. Those might distract you from the simple fact that you've got to remember that most contracts are fully performed. So if I ever asked you like, you know, how are most contracts going to be discharged? And I give you choices like, you know, set up some scenario and I tell you things like, oh, well, most people, you know, decide that it was almost good enough and they reform it or it's rescinded or it's whatever. Like that's not the reality. We talk about all these different kinds of examples and lots of different scenarios. But remember, the bottom line is that most people do what they say they're going to do. That's why they entered into this legally enforceable binding agreement. Because they were okay with agreeing to that. And so just remember that most contracts, the way they're discharged is by being fully performed. One of the ways people, you know, when contracts go bad is they say that there was no agreement because we didn't have voluntary consent to the terms of the contract. If they're saying consent was lacking, then you can't have an agreement because you didn't have that meeting in the mind. You didn't agree to the same thing. Someone, you know, made a mistake. Both people made a mistake. There was some fraud. Somebody's a liar. Misrepresentation, undue influence, duress, you know, these might be situations that are lacking that voluntary consent. If it's a mistake situation, in order for that contract to be voidable, the mistake needs to be a mistake of fact. So if it's a mistake of value or mistake of quality, that's not going to make the contract voidable. If someone else is getting a lousy deal because they thought it was better quality than it really was, they still agreed to buy that thing or enter that agreement. It just means the seller got away with selling something that was lower quality for a good deal. Bilateral, unilateral, one person makes a mistake versus two people make a mistake. It's, in order to make it voidable, it's gotta be some material back, so something really important. And if it was, again, one person's mistake, it's usually not gonna give them an excuse to get out of this contract, because they coulda, woulda, should known better, you know? If they had done their due diligence, they'd worked a little harder to figure that stuff out. But there's two kind of exceptions to this rule. The first one is, if the other person kind of is taking advantage of someone else's mistake, like they know that this other person misunderstood and is making a mistake and they're taking advantage of that, that's not okay, right? That's just wrong. And then the other one is if the error was a substantial mathematical mistake. So you guys have taken SISM classes, you know how some of those Excel formulas can be real complicated, and if you miss one little step, it messes the whole thing up really bad, okay? So this is an example of where that contract might be, you know, voidable if there's something like that going on. It's a substantial mathematical mistake that one of the parties made, and you can see it right there on the spreadsheet, how it should have looked and what it did look like. And that's the kind of thing that you would reformat, you know, reform it and probably go into the contract if you still want the business, that kind of thing. When it's a bilateral mistake, that's both people making that mistake. So if both parties to a contract are mistaken about the same material fact, it's still gotta be a material fact. If you're mistaken about the same thing, but it's something that doesn't matter, that's maybe not worth unraveling the entire contract over. But if it's something that was material, meaning important to the contract, and there's a little chart you can print out when you're studying too, if you wanted to. Fraud, somebody lies to you, you don't have voluntary consent because you're being lied to, you're not having that meeting of the minds. See, undue influence. So persuasion that is less than actual force, but more than just advice. So undue influence is something that is inducing someone to act according to the will or purpose of that dominating party. Someone kind of pushing you in a direction or giving you advice or telling you that's a really good deal, that's not the same thing, right? You still have control over what you're deciding to do. But someone who has like, maybe they're in a position where they can kind of dominate over someone and they have more of an influence over that, based on that relationship, then you might have a situation where it's benefiting that person in the relationship, unfairly hurting the person they've influence over. You might have a situation where it's undue influence. So some of the examples I have here are like, you know, doctor, patient, parent, child, spouses, you know, someone who's a guardian over a ward. Oh, and here, I put it in red. I already told you this, but you know, most common way to discharge is performing the contract. You know, in situations where someone has, let's see, okay, performed completely, contract is fulfilled, it's discharged, everybody walks away with what they agreed to, you know. Typically, they walk away happy, unless they got a bad deal, they might be grumpy, but they walk away with what they agreed to. Sometimes we have situations where a party in good faith performs almost everything in the contract. They can still enforce that contract against the other party under the doctrine of substantial performance. So it's not complete performance because they didn't do everything they agreed to do, but they did almost everything. We call that substantial performance. And these are the basic requirements. It has to be in good faith. They can't go into this deal knowing they're going to do like 80%, 90% and walk away. But in good faith, they try to do everything and there's just that little bit left that just cannot be done. Performance must not vary greatly from the performance promised in the contract. It must create substantially the same benefits as those promised in the contract. So there's a good example in your textbook about a guy who hired a contractor to build him like a log cabin. It's like a fancy log cabin, not just, you know, basic, like a nice house. And they had outlined all the requirements in the contract. They were making payments to the builder, this contractor, and he used subcontractors to do different parts. Well, one of the things in this contract he wanted was, with the plumbing, he wanted Reading pipes, the Reading pipe case. And when the contractor hired the sub to do the plumbing work, for whatever reason, the sub couldn't get Reading pipes or didn't get Reading pipes, but he got pipes that were just as good as, just as high quality as Reading, just a different name brand. Put them in the house, all this kind of stuff. The guy's making payments towards the builder, like you know, a little bit of time. And it's time for him to pay a big chunk of this house off to the builder, make that payment. And he discovered that lo and behold, when the house is like built, right? The wrong kind of pipes are in place. And so he goes to his builders like, we had a contract. Reading pipe is what you're supposed to use. That's not what's in this. I want you to tear the whole house down and replace these pipes, or tear up, you know, the house and replace all this plumbing with Reading pipes. What's the builder gonna say? No way. Pipes you got are just as good, good enough. Make your payment, pay for your house. That's like, I'm not gonna pay for the house because you breached the contract. And the builder's like, no, 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 no. You got good pipes in this house. The plumbing is excellent. It's just as good a quality. You need to pay for the house that I just built for you. What do you think happened? Well, they went to court. That's why it's in your book. But essentially what the court says is, you know, this is substantial performance. You can't really say yourself that it's substantially performed. The evidence would prove that it did, and the court will decide that. And the court was like, your contract said this evidence shows that the stuff you got was just as good as what you wanted. You don't get to keep your house for free. You have to pay for the house. And the builder's not required to like rip out and cause all this more expensive repairs and rip out walls and floors to replace this pipe with a different brand name. You know, I think the compensation was like $1, something nominal, like nothing, like, yeah, you're right, they didn't put in what you asked for, but you still owe for the house and you get $1 for the difference in value, which is like nothing, you know. And so that's the concept of substantial performance. Most of the time with a contract, it's based on this purity of the contract within the parties. You know, it's this person promising this person, and you make an agreement based on your satisfaction within the parties. When it comes to performing a contract to the satisfaction of another, you have that, you know, this completed work needs to satisfy someone else. It's usually not going to be for general contracts. If I'm having someone do work on my house and I'm getting a new driveway poured, you know, that's a reasonable person standard. Did they do a good job pouring a driveway that a reasonable person would say that's a good job? Like, there's no like footprints in the concrete. It's level. It goes from the road to my garage, like all those kind of basic things. But something that is more specific and unique to you, like think of artwork, you know, if you're getting family portraits made or a painting done, or you're hiring a sculptor or something that's more specific to your, tailored to your needs. If it's a personal type situation, that's when that contract would be subject to like the satisfaction guaranteed. So be careful when you go out into your future businesses and you start running the world, be careful about those customer satisfaction guarantees. Because normally, what's your standard for satisfaction? Reasonable person. Is a reasonable person satisfied with your work? But if you go and you promise something higher than that, then you're giving people the opportunity to, you know, have this higher level of satisfaction for the performance. And, you know, that might work well for your business model, or it might become a pain in the neck, depending on what kind of business you're in. If you have a lot of really hard to please clients or customers. We talked about breach of contract already. Let's see. We're basically out of time. More about damages over here. And we've covered damages in the other chapters too, but there's 4 kinds of broad categories of damages: compensatory, consequential, punitive, and nominal damages. We've, I guess, talked about all of those already. You know, compensatory damages, you know, compensating for the difference in loss. Consequential damages are those special damages that is something that may not be a loss that's not direct or immediate, kind of thing, like future lost profit. So I'm compensating for this extra cost that you had, and then I'm also going to give you future lost profits based on my breach of this contract. Punitive damages, same thing. Those are not as common, but they're more to like punish something with really terrible behavior. And then nominal damages is like the example I just gave you when it came to the Reddit pipe case, where yeah, there's some kind of damage because it didn't get performed exactly how it was in the contract, but there's no difference in value. So your damages that you win are going to be nominal. Like, here's $1 to say that you were right, but that represents the value of how much you will write. And does anybody have any questions? Before we go, I know I ran through all this stuff really, really fast. Hopefully it gave you more to think about and stuff as you go through your study guide topics. If you have any questions about the exam coming up, send me an email, we can set up a Zoom or whatever. Also for your projects, they're coming up next week. Things are really quick. What if I give y'all an extra week on your project? Would that help? It's weird having a project due right back to back with an exam. We'll still have to move on to the employment law chapter like that week before Thanksgiving, because we'll run out of weeks in the semester. But I'll go ahead and extend that deadline an extra week on the project so that it's not like exam project, like so close together. Hopefully that helps you guys. Of course, if you want to get your project done earlier than that, welcome to send me, questions, send me your drafts, all that kind of stuff. But good luck on the test, good luck on the project. I'll get all that updated. Happy Thanksgiving. You too. And then next week I'll have a Q&A still for the major project, like for questions. But I've also posted links to a couple of old Q&As. You saw that in the major project section. I posted those for like previous semester Q&As. So you can see it's the same kinds of questions stuff, but it might answer some questions you have. Hold on, let me turn this video off.